In the desert of southern Mesopotamia, amid the marshes and plains between the Euphrates and Tigris rivers, lay the ruins of humanity's first great cities. It was here, 5,000 years ago, that the Sumerians built an urban civilization that pioneered writing, monumental architecture, and epic literature. The story of Sumer, from its prehistoric villages to the mighty city-states of the Bronze Age, is a saga of conquest, innovation, and ultimately, collapse. Today we're going to go through the mythical origins of kingship in the antediluvian city of Eridu, to the glittering courts of Uruk and Ur, through to the periods of triumph and turmoil under native Sumerian and foreign Akkadian rulers, and finally to the Neo-Sumerian Renaissance and its ultimate end around 2000 BCE. And while we're at it, we'll examine together how Sumerians developed the world's earliest urban society, their advances in agriculture and trade, the invention of cuneiform writing, their stratified social order and powerful priesthoods, along with their rich religious and literary traditions. So, you might be surprised what we find in our time together today, as this society, 5,000 years ago, was much more advanced than you might think. So, let me first welcome you to the channel. It's good to have you all on board for another Bronze Age video. And we're doing a chronological history of Sumer today. Now, that is a brief history. We could hardly fit it all into a video of this length, but perhaps we'll go into more details later on. Now, if you're not yet subscribed to the channel, I invite you to do so. And thank you to those supporting on the Patreon and the YouTube memberships, along with the merch store. Now, welcome's out of the way. Let's get nice and relaxed, and we can go back to before the Bronze Age, the most ancient of ancient worlds. And indeed, we start in southern Mesopotamia in the 6th and 5th millennia BCE, a challenging environment of swampy wetlands and sparse rainfall. Yet, it was precisely here that the precursors of Sumerian civilization began to take root. Archaeologists refer to this early formative era as the Ubaid period, 5500 to 4000 BCE, when small village communities began to thrive by draining marshes and developing rudimentary irrigation techniques for agriculture. These pre-Sumerian inhabitants cultivated grains, wove textiles, fashioned simple painted pottery, and established the first communal institutions. Of course, over centuries, the settlements grew in size and therefore complexity, and that set the stage for the later Sumerians who would inherit that legacy and build upon the foundation. Now, interestingly, southern Mesopotamia at the time had virtually no forests or metal ores, but if properly irrigated, the soil was extremely fertile, yielding abundant amounts of grain. The bounty, however, depended on communal efforts to dig canals and control the floods, which likely spurred the development of organized government and temple authorities quite early on. And here's something intriguing. The question of where the Sumerians themselves came from is still a matter of debate. The language they used was unlike any other in the Near East. Of course, there's plenty of opinions. Some scholars theorize that the ancestors of the Sumerians may have lived along the shores of the Persian Gulf, in what is now eastern Arabia, until, of course, Rising sea levels at the end of the Ice Age drove them into Mesopotamia. Whether indigenous or immigrant, by the Ubaid period, these people had certainly fashioned a way of life that was steadily increasing in complexity. One of the most significant Ubaid period sites is Eridu, located near the old Persian Gulf shoreline in what is now southern Iraq. In Sumerian tradition, Eridu was revered as the first city ever created, the city of the first kings, where kingship was established on earth by divine decree. The Sumerian king list, an ancient record of rulers compiled long afterward, opens with the words, quote, "After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu." Names like Alulim as the first king, said to have reigned for a fantastically long 28,800 years. Well, perhaps no term limits back then. Clearly mythical in these details, such accounts show Eridu's status in Mesopotamian memory as a primordial city from which civilization itself sprang up from. And indeed, archaeology confirms its great antiquity. Excavations reveal a sequence of superimposed temples at Eridu, built in mud brick and repeatedly expanded over thousands of years. The earliest shrine on the site, dating to around 5500 BCE, was a modest 3 by 4 meter room with a simple altar. Up till now, it is the oldest known temple in Mesopotamia. Offerings of fish bones and ashes found on the altar floor suggest worshippers presented Enki, known later to the Akkadians as A, the god of fresh water and wisdom who was a patron of Eridu, with meals of fresh fish. As centuries went on, the humble chapel was rebuilt again and again, but always on the same sacred spot, each time a little larger, a little more elaborate, eventually becoming a massive mud brick sanctuary. Eridu's Temple of Enki, called the House of the Aquifer, thus stands as a tangible record of the nascent religious tradition that would characterize Sumerian cities. The idea that each city was home to a patron deity living in a grand central temple. In fact, Sumerian mythology even casts Eridu as a paradisiacal first city. Some later Mesopotamian writers described a primeval time when Eridu was a blissful garden, a concept that may have influenced the biblical idea of the Garden of Eden. By the late Ubaid period, Eridu had grown from a village into what we might think as a proto-city, with a population of several thousand. Pretty impressive for back then. But it was part of a network of emerging towns across the southern alluvium. Nearby sites like Lagash, Ur, and others show Ubaid phase occupation as well. Although true urbanization had not quite yet arrived, the ingredients were certainly assembling. Productive irrigated farms, communal centers for religion, specialized craft and long-distance trade for resources not available in the river valley, that is, such as stone, wood, and metal ores. There is even evidence of interaction between differing cultural groups. It's been theorized that in southern Mesopotamia of this era, ancestral Sumerian farming populations coexisted and fused with those nomadic Semitic pastoralists and fisher folk of the marshland. In fact, that might have given rise to the unique Sumerian culture and language. And it is at this point where Sumer's true urban revolution unfolds in the Uruk period, about 4000 to 3100 BCE. named, of course, after the city of Uruk, which became the largest and most influential settlement of its time. Now, a little bit more about Uruk. It's known as Unug in Sumerian, and later Erech in the Bible. It was initially a small Ubaid town, just like Eridu, but during the 4th millennium BCE, it underwent an explosive pattern of growth, transforming into a sprawling metropolis covering over 250 hectares, absolutely unprecedented in size. By around 34 to 3200, Uruk may have housed between 40 and 50,000 people, and that quite well and truly makes it the first city in the full sense, if we're talking about population-wise. But what exactly drove such rapid urbanization? That's a little bit more difficult to quantify. The exact causes are debatable, but in terms of archaeology, we see signs of agricultural surpluses feeding population increase, as well as the concentration of political and religious authority drawing people to the city. Uruk itself was divided into districts, including the Eanna precinct, dedicated to Inanna, the goddess of love, war, later called Ishtar, and the Anu Ziggurat precinct, dedicated to Anu, the sky god. Massive temple platforms were constructed, such as the limestone paved terrace supporting the Eanna temple complex and the high terrace for the whitewashed brick sanctuary, the White Temple of Anu. These monumental buildings, some of the first true ziggurats in Mesopotamia, must have required organized labor on a massive scale, and they're truly a testament to Uruk's role as a ceremonial center. But even more crucial, Uruk period temples were not just religious edifices, but economic hubs. The city's patron gods were believed to own the land and its produce, with the temple administration managing grain harvests, herds of livestock, and workshops for craft production. Ordinary farmers bought their barley, dates, or wool as dues to the temple's storehouse, and in return received allotments of food and goods for their sustenance. In effect, the temple had functioned as a centralized redistribution system. It received, stored, and disbursed the community's wealth, maintaining reserves to weather bad years. Of course, managing a complex economy like this, you needed an administrative class. So in come the priests and the scribes. These officials kept accounts of temple incomes and outlays, initially using carved stone tokens and seals, but eventually an even more revolutionary tool: writing. You can't have civilization without that, can't you? So it is within these late Uruk levels, that's 3400 to 31, that archaeologists have discovered the earliest known writing in the world. And just think about that. That's more than 5,000 years ago. Exciting, so exciting. Well, clay tablets from Uruk and a few other sites under Uruk's influence bear proto-cuneiform signs. Now, that is pictographic and numeric impressions that record transactions of grain, livestock, beer, and other commodities, certainly within its infancy, but it is what we can recognize as a written form of communication and record keeping. Of course, writing began as an extension of accounting. The Uruk bureaucracy needed a permanent way to track the flow of goods and labor rations in the temple economy. At first, simple drawings and tally marks sufficed. But over time, scribes got creative, and they developed standardized symbols and impressed them into the clay with a stylus, creating wedge-shaped marks. Certainly the beginnings of cuneiform script. By around 3200 BCE, these tablets even record personal names and titles. hinting at the first written administrative orders and ownership statements. The invention of writing had an enormous impact. It allowed the Sumerians to transmit information across time and distance with precision, facilitating more complex governance, and ultimately laying the groundwork for history and literature, which will come a little bit later. Uruk's ascendancy during this period was not only felt in Sumer proper. In what scholars term as the Uruk expansion, material culture from Uruk appears across a wide variety of regions beyond southern Mesopotamia. Archaeologists have found Uruk-style pottery, cylinder seals with Mesopotamian motifs, and even entire settlements established by colonists from Uruk in distant lands. For example, in Habuba Kabira in today's Syria, and at sites in southeastern Turkey and western Iran, Uruk period enclaves sprang up hundreds of kilometers away from Sumer. The outposts were likely trading colonies or administrative centers to secure vital resources: timber from the North Mountains, precious metals and stones, perhaps access to trade routes reaching as far as the Levant and the Indus Valley. By the late 4th millennium BCE, Uruk's influence, or at least its cultural style, extended from the Persian Gulf all the way to the Mediterranean. Technologically, the Uruk period saw plenty of important innovations. The potter's wheel came into use, enabling mass production of pottery, like the standardized beveled rim bowl. The Sumerians also harnessed the wheel for transport. Wheeled carts and wagons appear in this area, as does the use of the sail on boats, facilitating trade along rivers and the Gulf. And then there was the plough, that was improved for oxen to pull, greatly expanding agricultural output. With more food available, of course, not everyone needed to be a farmer, and Uruk boasted full-time artisans such as metallurgists, leather workers, and priests, supported by all that surplus grain. Good times. One exquisite artifact from Uruk, the Warka vase, shows a procession of offerings brought to the goddess Inanna, carved in alabaster. The layers of imagery on the vase, the farmers, livestock, priests, and the goddess herself, capture an organization of society still centered around the temple. The Uruk period also saw the first heroic figures emerge in Sumerian tradition. Although purely historical records from this time are pretty rare, later legends recall that Uruk's early kings were culture heroes. Of course, you know the name Gilgamesh. He's the most famous, who in Sumerian tales is the 5th king of Uruk. The Sumerian king list indeed names, quote, Gilgamesh, whose father was a phantom, i.e., of an unknown father, and credits him with a reign of 126 years in the distant past. Gilgamesh likely lived, if he was real, near the end of the early dynastic period, as the 27th to the 26th century BCE, but by the Bronze Age, he'd certainly become a household name. Later epic poetry describes him building Uruk's monumental walls and going on fantastic adventures. The kernel of these stories may hark back to the pride Sumerians felt in Uruk's grandeur and at the dawn of cities. Even an early proto-epic fragment from Uruk, written centuries after the Uruk period but set in primordial time, lords the city's walls and temple precinct, suggesting that even by the Bronze Age, Sumerians looked upon Uruk's ancient achievements with reverence. But you know what they say about good times. They don't always last forever. By around 3100 BCE, the Uruk-centric system experienced quite an upheaval. Many of the distant Uruk colonies were abandoned, and Uruk's dominance within Sumer seems to have waned, possibly due to shifting river courses, climate stress, perhaps internal political change. In Mesopotamian legend, this era is punctuated by a great flood. The King's List notes laconically that kingship passed through several cities, and then the flood swept over, implying a break in history. A Sumerian poem, often called the Eridu Genesis, composed 2300 BCE, tells of gods deciding to inundate the land, and of one righteous man, Ziusudra, who built an ark and survived the deluge at the behest of the god Enki. Indeed, it's all familiar. These tales of flood and renewal likely echo real floods, though. We see them in a lot of different cultures. Certainly devastated parts of southern Mesopotamia, that's for sure. Indeed, archaeologists at Ur found a thick layer of water-laid clay separating the Ubaid and Uruk remains from the later strata, evidence of a significant flood event around 2800 BCE. Well, whether or not this specific flood underlies the myth, the end of the Uruk period did usher in a new chapter of Sumerian civilization. The stage was certainly set for the early dynastic period, a time when multiple competing city-states blossomed in Sumer, inheriting the legacies of that now gone Uruk age. Are you still with me? We're only just getting started. By circa 2900 BCE, Sumer had regrouped into a mosaic of independent city-states. Each city and its surrounding hinterland had formed a small kingdom centered on a cult of its patron deity and ruled by a secular leader. Lugal, meaning great man or king, or an ensi, a city governor. Now remember those words because you'll hear them come up a lot when you're talking about Sumer as Lugal and ensi, king and governor. The early dynastic period spans roughly 2900 to 2330 BCE and is traditionally divided into sub-periods, as being ED 1, 2, and 3 in modern chronology. During this time we find the first extensive written records, and I'm not just talking administrative tablets, but also inscriptions by kings bragging of their deeds, and possibly the earliest hymns and narrative texts. We also have rich archaeological evidence, including the spectacular royal tombs at Ur, which together paint a picture of a vibrant, competitive era in Sumerian history. But politically, there wasn't a single city that dominated all of Sumer in the early dynastic. Rather, the situation was that power rotated among the major centers. Alliances and rivalries were always changing. We have cities such as Uruk, Ur, Kish, Lagash, Umur, Nippur, Shurupak, and Eshnuna. Now that's just to name the prominent ones, and they had their own dynasties of rulers. The Sumerians themselves viewed this period through a somewhat legendary lens. The Sumerian Kings List, composed in the Ur-3 period, but reporting to record far earlier times, gives us a sequence of dynasties. After the mythical antediluvian kings, it says kingship resumed at Kish. Quote, after the flood had swept over, kingship came down again at Kish. Now, where exactly was Kish? Well, it was a city on the northern edge of Sumer, near the modern city of Tel el-Uhaymir, and is often listed first in the post-flood times. Indeed, King of Kish became a title that implied primacy or hegemony among Sumerian cities. Early dynastic rulers from various cities sometimes adopted the title King of Kish to legitimize themselves as the foremost leader, even if they had never even stepped foot in Kish or never weren't born in Kish. But it all indicates that Kish had an early prestige as a center of power, much like later on how we see the same for Babylon, this kind of thing. Well, some modern historians do suspect that Kish may have been an early hegemon, or at least symbolized a unifying kingship in Sumerian ideology. From early dynastic texts and excavations, we can begin to flesh out individual rulers who straddle myth and history. One of the earliest, whose historicity is evidenced outside the king's list, is Emne-Baragesi of Kish, who is said to have lived in ED 1, that is perhaps around 2600 BCE. Emne-Baragesi is credited by later tradition with capturing weapons from Elam, that is a neighboring land to the east, and significantly, archaeologists at Nippur found a vase fragment inscribed with his name. Now, that's a pretty hard piece of evidence that a king named Emne-Baragesi did exist. And then we have his son, Aga of Kish, who appears in a Sumerian story as a contemporary rival of Gilgamesh in Uruk, suggesting conflicts between Kish and Uruk were happening even in legend. Another key city-state rivalry that emerges in ED times is between Lagash and Umma, two cities in eastern Sumer, divided by a fertile boundary region called Gu-Edin. Now, this dispute over territory became one of the first recorded wars in history. We're fortunate enough to have detailed descriptions, at least from the victors. The kings of Lagash left behind inscribed stones and stelae recounting their fights with Umma. One of these is the famous Stele of the Vultures from Lagash. It dates to around 2450 BCE, that is, corresponding ED 3 period. Now, although it is fragmentary, its inscription and carved relief images celebrate the victory of Eanatum of Lagash over Umma. We learn that generations earlier, a border was fixed between the two by Mesolim of Kish, a powerful earlier king who acted as a mediator. But Umma later violated the boundary. And so, according to the text, the god of Umma ordered its ruler to seize the contested fields of Lagash. The Patesi of Umma, by the command of his god, plundered Gu-Edin, the territory beloved of Ningirsu, that is from the text. Eanatum, the ruler or Ensi of Lagash, claims that his own patron deity Ningirsu, the god of war and agriculture, then commanded him in a dream to march to battle. In the ensuing war, Eanatum led the armies of Lagash to defeat Umma's forces. The Stele of the Vultures depicts vultures carrying off the severed heads of the defeated enemy. A pretty grisly trophy, but an effective image of triumph. On the carved relief, Eanatum's infantry advance in tight formation, wearing helmets and wielding spears and axes, while Ningirsu himself is shown in a mythological form, helping trap Umma's soldiers in a net. While one can certainly imagine the pride of Lagash's citizens at this divinely sanctioned victory, doesn't get much better than that. Eanatum's inscription not only boasts of piling up the bodies of Umma's soldiers, but it also records a treaty. The defeated Umma was made to swear not to encroach again and to pay heavy tribute of grain to the temple of Ningirsu. Lagash's archives reveal a surprisingly legalistic approach to the conflict. Enatum's successor, Enmetena, of Lagash, records renewing the border markers and even suing for peace with a later ruler of Umma, indicating that written agreements and curses against violators were certainly a key part of intercity diplomacy in those days. And that really is noteworthy. The practice of using an inscribed stele to demarcate borders and of invoking gods as guarantors of treaties is first seen in this stele, setting precedents for later international law in Mesopotamia, and, of course, in the broader Bronze Age world of later times. We see the same sorts of things in the stele after the Battle of Kadesh between the Hittites and the Egyptians under Ramesses II. Well, back to Sumer. The religious city of Nippur, home of Enlil's great sanctuary, held a special status throughout these centuries. Kings from different cities all respected Nippur. It was common belief that no man could rule Sumer legitimately without getting Enlil's blessing, and he had to get that from Nippur, of course. Thus, even when no single king dominated politically, a shared Sumerian cultural identity was maintained through common worship at Nippur and other holy sites. But while all the wars raged on, Sumerian society was also developing in its own sophistication. The economy in the early dynastic times remained centered on temple estates, but secular palaces were becoming powerful as well. Kings or lugals appear more prominently, often claiming divine favor or semi-divine lineage. We see the growth of a warrior aristocracy with bronze weapons and light chariots, but they were usually drawn by donkeys, not by horses. There is evidence also of a class of free men and laborers, and also slaves, often war captives or debt servants, at the bottom of the social pyramid. The construction of lavish royal tombs in this period suggests the elite commanded enormous resources. And nowhere is this more evident than at the royal cemetery of Ur, dating to roughly the early dynastic III period, 2500 BCE. British archaeologist Leonard Woolley's excavations at Ur in the 1920s uncovered tombs of extraordinary wealth, gold jewelry, musical instruments, ornate weapons, and all other grave goodies. You really had a bit of everything. All the luxuries of the ancient world, all in one nice, neat little hole. That's what archaeology is all about. Well, in some of these tombs, though, the main burial, a king or queen, was accompanied by a retinue of attendants who appear to have been sacrificed to serve their master in the afterlife. For instance, the tomb believed to belong to Queen Puabi, which is labeled at the site as PG 800, contained the bodies of dozens of servants and guards, dressed in fine garments and gold ornaments, who went to the grave with her. It's a pretty macabre ritual, sure, but it just drives home that point of the godlike status of Sumerian royalty. It's also perhaps a haunting glimpse at the world view of life's hierarchy continuing after death. I have a full video on Sumerian funeral practices, if you're interested in that. It goes into quite a lot of detail. Well, let's continue. From these royal burials also came artworks that reveal much about Sumerian life. For example, the Standard of Ur, a wooden box found in a royal tomb at Ur, bears intricate mosaics illustrating the dual roles of the ruler. On one side, a war scene, showing the king leading a Sumerian army. Chariots drawn by wild donkeys trample over enemies. Infantry with spears and copper helmets march in formation. And finally, the downtrodden prisoners presented to the king. But on the opposite side, there is a scene of peace, depicting a banquet with the king and nobles drinking while a musician plays a lyre. And lower registers show laborers bringing animals, fish and produce as tribute. Either way, it makes the message pretty clear. An image tells 1,000 words. The king protects the city in war and ensures prosperity in peace. Despite the focus on rulers and temples, ordinary life in Sumer thrived under this urban order. Citizens lived in mud brick houses along narrow streets. Excavations show multi-room homes, often centered on a courtyard, with kitchens, storage, and living quarters. A clay figurine might be set in a household shrine to offer prayers to personal gods. The Sumerians were also renowned for enjoying life's pleasures, too. Archaeological finds include a royal game of Ur, a board game with checkers and dice, and even evidence of prolific beer brewing. Of course, back then, you wouldn't be drinking normal water. That's dangerous. It's far safer to brew it into beer, something like that, and then consume it. But do remember that back then the alcohol content was much lower. People would usually have beer for breakfast, especially in the case of what we found at the rations list at the pyramids for the workers. Usually they were paid in grain and beer, sort of thing. Well, in fact, a famous Sumerian hymn to the goddess Ninkasi doubles as a recipe for beer, describing in poetic terms the step-by-step process of how to make the best Sumerian beer. Of course, it's a staple drink for all classes, consumed with straws from large jars. Music and song were beloved. Harps and lyres were played both in palaces and taverns, and by this period, the cuneiform record even preserves the first known musical notation and lullabies. All these details, they don't portray a society of Bronze Age cave dwellers or anything like that, but rather a very human picture. Sure, devout and hierarchical, definitely, but they certainly knew how to celebrate the joys of feasting and entertainment. The richness of material culture in the early dynastic age also reflects a burgeoning long-distance trade system. Many precious materials found in Sumer had to be imported. We're talking lapis lazuli and gold coming from as far as Central Asia, the modern region of Afghanistan. Tin as well to alloy with copper for bronze, possibly from Iran or beyond. Cedar wood from the forests of the Levant, Lebanon and Syria, and diorite stone from Magan in the Arabian Gulf. Now, Magan is roughly modern-day Oman. Sumerian inscriptions proudly list these acquisitions. The rulers of Lagash, for example, describe bringing timbers from the Amanus and Lebanon ranges, copper and gold from distant lands, and indeed diorite from Magan. One Lagash king, Gudea, who ruled slightly later during the Gutian interlude, around 2140 BCE, recorded how he obtained cedar logs, imported rare stones, and welcomed ships from Dilmun, laden with exotic goods. Now, Dilmun, by the way, that's roughly around Bahrain. Now, such records show that by the mid-3rd millennium, Sumer was indeed a hub of the trading world that connected the Indian Ocean to the Mediterranean. Merchants from Sumer, sometimes acting on behalf of the temples, traveled or at least sent emissaries abroad, exchanging Sumer's textiles, wool, grain, and crafted wares for the metals and timber that their homeland lacked. The Sumerians progressively extended their cultural reach and also developed their intellectual life. Short hymns and temple songs have been found, as well as early versions of tales about heroes like Gilgamesh, Lugalbanda, and Enmerkar. Sumerian scribes by the ED3 period were recording their heroic traditions. Kings like Etana of Kish and Gilgamesh of Uruk, who appear in the King's List and now in epic tales, certainly show how history and myth sometimes have a bit of a blurry line between. Think about it with a bit of Greek mythology as well. The ancient world, it just goes hand in hand like that. Now, Gilgamesh, likely a historical king around the 26th century BCE, was already being immortalized in poems as a demigod who battled monsters and sought immortality, indicating a rich oral lore being committed to writing. In cultural terms, the early dynastic period laid the groundwork for what we now recognize as classical Sumerian civilization. The Sumerian language was at this time in everyday use. Schools, or as they called them, eduba, tablet houses, were established to train scribes, who had to master hundreds of signs to produce neat-looking tablets. From scribal training exercises and school texts, we see the first proverbs and fables, indicating a tradition of wisdom literature. For example, one Sumerian proverb admonishes that, quote, "He who may possess much silver may be happy. He who possesses much barley may be happy. But he who has nothing at all can sleep." A wry commentary on wealth and contentment. The Sumerians also began writing down their myths and epics in this period, or at least circulating them orally. By the end of ED3, short narrative poems in Sumerian existed about legendary kings. 5 separate Sumerian poetic tales about Gilgamesh are actually known from later copies. Although the fully developed Sumerian literature would blossom in the subsequent Old Babylonian period, its seeds were certainly planted in the early dynastic times. As far as religion, well, no surprises, it continued to dominate intellectual life. Each city's temple was not only an economic center, but the literal seat of political power. In many cases, early rulers governed as priest-kings. The Sumerian title En denoted a priestly lord. For instance, the city of Uruk had a female high priestess of Inanna who were royal family members, indicating the intertwining of sacred and royal authority. Not unique to Sumeria. Well, the pantheon of the Sumerian gods took on a more fixed form. An, sky; Enlil, air, storm, king of the gods, whose main temple was at Nippur; Enki, water and wisdom, at Eridu; Ninurzag, earth and fertility; Nana, the moon, at Ur; Utu, the sun at Larsa or Sipar; Inanna, love and war, based in Uruk, and many other minor gods. Sumerian religion was anthropomorphic. Gods were thought to live in their temple houses, to eat the food offered to them, and to engage in very human-like dramas according to myth. Maintaining the favor of the patron deity through proper rituals, offerings, and temple upkeep, well, that was essential to a city's good fortune. When kings boast in inscriptions, they often credit their successes to the will of their city's god, and lavish praise on building that god's temple. This close god-king relationship is epitomized in the sacred marriage rite that some cities practiced, where the king would actually marry the goddess in a ritual embodied by her high priestess to ensure fertility and prosperity for the land. By the end of the early dynastic period, one city-state had managed to assert itself above all the rest, albeit briefly, and that was Umma under its ambitious king Lugal-Zaggisi. Ruling circa 2350, Lugal-Zaggisi claimed to have conquered the entirety of Sumer, and even lands beyond. In a boastful inscription, he states that Enlil granted him kingship over the nations, and that he had made the lands from the upper sea to the lower sea, that is, a reference to the Mediterranean and Persian Gulf, obedient to him. We may presume that it's a bit of exaggeration, but what is certain is that Lugal-Zaggisi defeated his long-time rival Lagash, and that ended Lagash's dynasty, which had endured for generations since the time of Eonatum. He also established his rule over Ur, Uruk, and several other Sumerian cities, making Uruk his capital, perhaps harking back to its ancient prestige. It seemed as if Sumer might finally be united under one native ruler. But hold your horses. Lugal-Zaggisi's triumph would become quite short-lived. There was a new power on the horizon, rising in northern Mesopotamia, and one that would dramatically end the independence of the Sumerian city-states, the first conquerors. Mid-24th century BCE, a talented and ruthless Semitic chieftain from the north swept down into Sumer and forever changed its destiny. I'm sure you've heard of him. They called him Sharukin, meaning true king, but in our modern vernacular, he is Sargon of Akkad. He founded the world's first recorded empire. His rise marks the start of the Akkadian Empire, circa 2334 to 2154, and represents the first time Sumer was conquered and united by an outside force. Yet, Sargon shrewdly wove together Sumerian and Semitic elements, and the Akkadian Age became a time of cross-pollination. Sumerian culture would influence the conquerors, even as Akkadian language and rule spread over Sumer. According to later legends, Sargon had quite humble origins. A Babylonian birth myth portrays his mother as an unwed priestess who gave birth in secret and set her infant adrift on the river in a basket, only for the baby to be rescued by a water drawer and raised as his son. Pretty common myth, isn't it? Well, this Sargon legend not only inspired the biblical story of Moses, but it also shows Sargon's aura as a man of destiny, a self-made king. Now, historically, Sargon first appears as an official, a cupbearer to the king of Kish. Around 2334, however, he rebelled, seized power, and then from Kish launched a series of campaigns to subdue the rest of Sumer. The decisive clash came when Sargon defeated Lugal-Zaggisi of Uruk, the would-be master of Sumer, capturing him in chains and parading him in humiliation, which was the style at the time. With Uruk, Ur, Lagash, and other major cities fallen, Sargon effectively became the king of Sumer. He established a new capital city, Akkad, and at a strategically central location, though its exact site is unfortunately unknown today. Perhaps it's another place we can find, like how we found Troy back in those old times. Well, from Akkad he ruled over not only Sumer, but vast territories beyond. An empire, in its true sense, that eventually stretched north into Syria and Anatolia, west into the Mediterranean, and east into Elam and Iran. his conquests are recorded in later chronicles, and possibly in his own commemorative inscriptions. One Akkadian text, preserved in copies, has him boast, Sargon, king of Kish, triumphed in 34 battles, and that he crossed the sea, likely the Persian Gulf and beyond. He is said to have set up his statues in distant lands, a way of declaring his domination. There are references to his army reaching Mari on the middle Euphrates and Ashur on the Tigris, taking treasure from the Elamites, and even sending ships from Akkad to sail to Dilmun and Maluha, which may correspond to Bahrain and the Indus Valley. While some of these claims might be propagandistic hyperbole, there is no doubt that Sargon forged a realm far beyond anything he had seen before. For the first time, Sumer was but one core province in a larger multi-ethnic empire, ruled from a new city called Akkad. But how exactly did Sargon maintain control of Sumer and all these other lands? It wasn't like he had any point of reference. Well, he got to work. He pioneered new methods of imperial governance. He stationed trusted governors, Ensi, many of them Akkadian officials or his own kin, to oversee key cities. For example, in the city of he installed his daughter, Enheduanna, as high priestess of the moon god Nana, a brilliant move that secured religious loyalty. Now, in fact, Enheduanna, who served as priestess in for decades, is famous in her own right, not just for being Sargon's daughter, but as the world's earliest known author by name. She composed numerous Sumerian hymns and poems, including passionate hymns to the goddess Inanna, which have survived on clay tablets. Enheduanna's writings not only show a royal woman actively shaping religious culture, but they also exemplify how Akkadians embraced Sumerian language and religion. She wrote in Sumerian, the sacred tongue, invoking Sumerian deities, yet she was the daughter of a Semitic conqueror. Now, if that's not a symbol of the fusion of cultures under Akkad, I don't know what is. Now, what about the Akkadian administration? Well, they likely collected tribute and taxes from Sumerian cities to fund the imperial center. There is evidence of Akkadian officials taking over temples and palace estates. However, rather than attempt to suppress Sumerian culture, the Akkadian kings often presented themselves as heirs to Sumer's legacy. Sargon took the title King of Sumer and Akkad, signaling a dual heritage. His grandson, Naram-Sin, even went a step further. After winning major victories, including a crushing coalition of rebellious Sumerian cities, that was a failure, Naram-Sin assumed the unprecedented title, King of the 4 quarters of the earth. And, as mentioned, he did declare himself a living god, too. Stelae from Naram-Sin's reign depict him with the horned crown of divinity. While some Sumerians saw this as, frankly, blasphemous, it shows how the ideology of kingship had evolved under this new empire. The ruler now claimed near absolute divine status over an immense realm. In fact, Naram-Sin's boldness was commemorated in his victory stele, which depicts him wearing a godlike helmet and climbing a mountain above his defeated foes. The first Mesopotamian king shown as a deity in art. But, in Sumerian memory, this hubris was punished. A famous Sumerian poem, The Curse of Agade, Agade was their word for Akkad, blames Naram-Sin's sacrilegious attack on Enlil's temple for the entire downfall of the empire. That's right, the whole thing is his fault, betraying the gods themselves, withdrawing support, and sending the Gutians to ravage Akkad. Sorry about the spoiler alert, but we're about to get to that section. Now, forming an empire, that's one thing. Keeping an empire, that is an entirely different skill set. After Sargon's long reign, said to be about 56 years, pretty long, but, and that of his sons too, internal dissent and external pressures began to mount. Sumerian cities, used to their autonomy, began to grow weary of their Akkadian governors. There were revolts. One chronicler says that, quote, in every city the son rebelled against his father during the reign of Sargon's grandson Shar-Kalishari. It seems that the golden age of the Akkadians was well and truly coming to an end. It didn't help that foreign enemies were pressing in as well. In particular, groups of mountain people from the northeast, known as the Gutians, began raiding Mesopotamia. They are depicted in Sumerian sources as wild, uncivilized highlanders, quote, not classed among people, with human intelligence but canine instincts and monkey features. Pretty harsh description, but okay. These Gutian incursions, combined with perhaps a period of drought and famine around 2200 BCE, led to the Akkadian Empire's fragmentation. Around 2154, Akkad's last king fell, and the empire was collapsed into chaos. And here, Mesopotamia proper enters a dark interval, often called the Gutian period. Okay, the Akkadians are gone. Good news, right? Well, not really. With Akkad gone, Sumer was left in disarray. Contemporary Sumerian laments describe this time as one of famine and despair, and they blame it all on divine wrath. Now, we've mentioned that text, the Curse of Akkad. It recounts how the Akkadian king Naram-Sin angered the patron deity Enlil by attacking the holy city of Nippur, resulting in the gods withdrawing their favor and sending the Gutians as a scourge. Well, the Gutians poured out of the Zagros mountains, and they're portrayed as a plague of barbarism. They filled the land with wickedness, took away the wife from him who had a wife, took away the child from him who had a child. They had no kingship traditions, no understanding of rights, that is, R-I-T-E-S, and brought the thriving fields of Sumer to ruin. Well, there is maybe a little bit of hyperbole in these accounts. Centralized rule and maintenance of infrastructure faltered under Gutian disruption. Sumerian texts emphasize this disruption without a strong king. The roads grew tangled and impassable, and the fields yielded weeds. A poetic way to describe famine and lawlessness. Indeed, one copy of Utu Hengal's victory inscription recounts the Gutian rule had blocked the roads and caused the tall grass to grow on the highways, so commerce and communication are simply ground to a halt. But you could probably tell the video's not over yet, so hold your horses. It's not the end of the story. Not all is lost. Even in this troubled period, pockets of Sumerian leadership persisted. The city of Lagash, in particular, experienced a local revival under a line of independent rulers. Most famous among them is Gudea of Lagash, circa 2140, who was not subjugated by the Gutians. Gudea though only styling himself NC, governor, effectively ruled a small kingdom centered on Lagash. He's remembered for devoutly rebuilding temples, especially the great temple of Ninkirsu, and for bringing prosperity back to his city. His numerous statues and inscriptions depict a pious and just ruler. But he doesn't just boast of conquests. Instead, he emphasizes piety and the well-being of the people. One description describes Gudea bringing in cedars from the mountains and diorite and gold from distant lands for the temples, showing that trade was well and truly still alive. Under Gudea and his predecessor Ur-Baba, Lagash was kind of a refuge of Sumerian tradition amid that foreign domination. Ultimately, the Sumerians would reclaim their political autonomy. Around 2110, a southern Sumerian leader named Uta-Hengal, the king of Uruk, rose up and finally expelled the Gutian invaders. Utu-Hengal's victory is recorded in a dramatic royal inscription known from later copies. It relates that Enlil, the chief god, commissioned Utu-Hengal to eliminate the Gutians, metaphorically called, quote, the fanged serpent of the mountain who carried off the kingship of Sumer to the mountains. Utu-Hengal rallied the Sumerian cities for a final battle. In the text, he prays to Inanna for aid, and then engages the Gutian army led by their king Tirgan. He manages to trap Tirgan, who fled to the mountains, and capture him, bringing him back in a neck stock. With this, the Gutian yoke was finally cast off. Utu-Hengal proclaimed the restoration of order. The kingship of the land of Sumer was brought back from the mountains to the cities. After years of neglect, canals were finally being redug. The roads were safe again, and the fields returned to cultivation. He was going to make Sumer great again. Well, tragically for Utu-Hengal, he enjoyed the triumph only for a short time. Perhaps only 7 years. Fate struck. An accident, in which he is said to have drowned in the Euphrates River. But the torch of Sumerian revival was taken up by other dynamic leaders. One who may have been Utu-Hengal's military commander or an ambitious governor, Ur-Nammu, the ruler of Ur. Ur-Nammu deposed Utu-Hengal's heir around 2112 BCE and founded what is known as the Third Dynasty of Ur, also called the Neo-Sumerian Empire. The establishment of the Third Dynasty of Ur, or just Ur-3, is the final great flourish of Sumerian civilization. A century of strong centralized rule, cultural resistance, and relative peace, often seen as a Sumerian golden age, at least before the final decline. Ur-Nammu, 2112 to 2095 BCE, and his successors, Shulgi, Amarsin, Shusin, and Ibisin, ruled over a united Mesopotamia. From roughly 2112 to 2004 BCE. Though Semitic Akkadian influence was present, the kings proudly embraced that Sumerian heritage. They presided over what one might even call a national revival of Sumerian language, literature, and religion, all while running an efficient state apparatus, and that is a difficult balancing act. Ur-Nammu began by firmly securing Sumer and Akkad, that is the northern regions. He took the title King of Ur, King of Sumer and Akkad, deliberately invoking both traditions. Militarily, He pushed back any remaining Gutian threats, and also campaigned against pockets of local rebellion. But Ur-Nammu is remembered less for conquests than for construction and law-giving. He sponsored an ambitious building program, including the earliest monumental ziggurats, that is, the stepped pyramidal temples. At Ur, he constructed a magnificent ziggurat dedicated to the moon god Nana. The ruins of this edifice, a massive three-tiered platform of mud brick faced with bitumen and brick, are still quite impressive today as a testament to the engineering of the time. Similarly, he built or restored temples in Eridu, Nippur, and Uruk, and other cities, effectively stamping his authority across Sumer through bricks and mortar. Each brick from each of his projects was stamped with an inscription of his name and titles, a practice that reinforced his pious image and certainly helps identifying who built the structures. But, perhaps most remarkably, he's credited with issuing one of the earliest law codes in the world, that is the Code of Ur-Nammu, fragments of which have been discovered, and it even predates the famous Code of Hammurabi by over 300 years. But only parts of it survive, unfortunately. But still, its prologue speaks of Ur-Nammu as the king who, quote, established equity in the land and protected the weak. The laws, written in Sumerian, address various offenses and their punishments. Notably, the code imposes monetary compensation for injuries, rather than the later eye for an eye lex talionis physical retaliation. Significantly, Ur-Nammu's code shows a shift from the vengeance-based justice of earlier times to a system of fines and restitution, suggesting an advanced concept of fairness. Let's take an example. If a man caused another man's eye to be lost, the code prescribed a payment of silver rather than bodily retribution. This early legal text shows the Ur-3 king's ideology of ruling as protectors of the weak, rather ahead of its time, I must say. But Ur-Nammu died in battle, according to one account, fighting an eastern enemy, and was succeeded by his son Shulgi, reigning from 2094 to 2047. King Shulgi took the Neo-Sumerian state to its zenith. Reigning for 47 years, he proved to be a multifaceted ruler, a brilliant administrator, a self-promoter, even a patron of culture. Early in his reign, he continued his father's projects, completing ziggurats like the Great Ziggurat of Ur, and expanding the empire's borders further into Assyria and Elamite territory. To better control his territory, he instituted an efficient provincial system and an elaborate bureaucracy. He then reorganized the empire into about 20 provinces, each overseen by a trusted governor, often family members or in-laws, and each with his responsibilities to send regular taxes in kind to the central treasury. He also reinstituted the Bala system, which is a rotating tax and tribute burden shared amongst provinces to ensure a steady flow of resources to Ur. The Ur-3 state kept meticulous records. Tens of thousands of clay tablets from this period have been found, and I'm sure we're going to find plenty more. They record everything from temple offerings to the number of sheep delivered by each province annually. It appears to have been a highly bureaucratized economy, too, with standard units of measure and a unified calendar that Shulgi introduced for the whole realm. But he didn't just excel at administration. He cultivated an almost legendary persona. In a series of royal praise hymns, likely composed by court scribes or perhaps Shulgi himself as he claims, the king boasts extravagantly of his prowess, These self-laudatory hymns present him as a kind of superhuman. Let's take this one passage for example. Quote from the text, I, Shulgi, was a hero already in the womb. I am a fierce-looking lion, begotten by a dragon. I am the king of the 4 regions. I am the herdsman and the shepherd of the black-headed people. The black-headed people, of course, is a reference to what the Sumerians called themselves. Well, he describes himself too as a learned scholar. Quote, I am a knowledgeable scribe of Nisaba. I have perfected my wisdom. And also as a high priest of the gods, performing every ritual correctly. Famously, he bragged about his physical endurance. One hymn relates how he strengthened the roads and built rest houses, and then ran a distance of 100 miles from Nippur to Ur and back in a single day to prove his speed, outpacing the sun god Udu. Well, I think we can pretty much put that down to a poetic hyperbole. But it does convey a message that Shulgi was tireless in serving the gods and his kingdom. He also mentions improving the roads and way stations, and yes, indeed, he established a system of royal post roads with lodging stations, an ancient precursor to a postal service that kept his realm connected. By declaring himself divine late in his reign, having temples and offerings in his name, Shulgi sought to cement loyalty and inspire awe. The cult of the king became an element of Ur-3's statecraft. Offerings were made to Shulgi's statue, and he was referred to as the god of the land in official documents. Despite this, somewhat egoistic turn, he appears to have been genuinely effective. Under his rule, the economy prospered, and there was a flourishing of the arts. Scribes copied and canonized Sumerian literary works and composed new ones. Many of the Sumerian myths and epics have come down to us, were preserved through the old Babylonian copies of texts set in Ur-3 times. Well, by the time of Shulgi, Sumerian was no longer the mother tongue of much of the population. Akkadian had replaced that. Yet Shulgi's court championed Sumerian as a classical way of communicating, commissioning scribal academies to preserve it. He placed royal daughters and sons as priestesses and governors throughout the land to tighten cultural unity, and his reign saw a renaissance in Sumerian literature. Scribes in cities like Nippur and Ur compiled extensive lexical lists, bilingual dictionaries, hymns, and songs in Sumerian, ensuring the legacy of Sumer's language and lore would live on. Certainly sounds like a hard act to follow, don't you think? Well, that's precisely because it was. After Shulgi's long and successful reign, his successors had shorter rules and increasing troubles. Amar-Sin and Shu-Sin, who ruled in the 2040s to 30s, continued to hold the empire, sure, but they faced growing external threats, especially from the Amorite tribes pressing in from the west, and renewed pressure from Elam in the east. Well, who were the Amorites? They were West Semitic, semi-nomadic groups. They gradually infiltrated Mesopotamia. To hold them off, Shu-Sin constructed a massive defensive wall along his western frontier, stretching perhaps 170 miles between the Tigris and Euphrates. We hear of Shu-Sin's wall as a great fortification project, but such lines are hard to man completely, and nomadic Amorites likely just circumvented it. So despite these efforts, the incursions continued, and provinces on the empire's edges began to be slowly eaten away at. The last king, Ibi-Sin, 2028 to 2004 BCE, saw the unraveling of Ur's control. One by one, peripheral territories stopped sending tribute, or just broke away. Texts from Ibbi Sin's last years depict a desperate situation. Grain shipments from the breadbasket regions were cut off, causing famine in Ur. A series of letters between Ibbi Sin and his officials paint a dire picture. The king in Ur begs for grain from the governor of Isin as starvation worsens, while that governor, Ishbi-Era, uses the crisis to declare independence and move the precious grain stores to his own city. It was a perfect storm of betrayal from within and attack from without. Ibbi Sin apparently couldn't do much as the empire he inherited fragmented all around him. Finally, around 2004 BCE, an alliance of the Elamites with some Semitic auxiliaries attacked Ur itself. It was sieged, sacked, and reduced to ruins, and its people were slaughtered or deported. And King Ibbi Sin himself was captured and carried off to Elam in chains. Well, that's certainly a very sad end to the third dynasty of Ur, and with it, the last flowering of Sumerian political power. Well, the fall of Ur was commemorated by the Sumerians in a heart-wrenching poetic lament. One, the lamentation over the destruction of Ur, gives a vivid sense of the catastrophe from a Sumerian perspective. It describes how the patron god Nana deserted his city, allowing the enemy to enter unchecked. Quote, "Upon the city which the sun god Udu loved, dust has fallen. Upon the temple of the great gods, dust has fallen. The people are scattered abroad, and the city has become a wasteland." This image of Ur, once the seat of a mighty empire, now desolate, wind blowing the dust throughout the ruins, is perhaps one of the most haunting in ancient literature. The Lamentations also mention how the gods of Sumer, one by one, abandoned their cities to the storm of destruction. Enlil unleashed the evil storm, and the people groan. It's an uncanny awareness of the tragedy of lost civilization, as if the Sumerians themselves knew how profound their own collapse was. Though the political power of the Sumerians ended with the collapse of period of Ur III, the legacy didn't vanish overnight. A native dynasty at Isin picked up the kingship after Ur's fall, and Isin's rulers maintained Sumerian traditions and language for a time, even as the demographic balance shifted with more West Semitic Amorites settling in the cities. In the following centuries, the Isin-Larsa period and Old Babylonian period, as 2000 to 1600, Amorite rulers took control of the south. They increasingly spoke the Akkadian language in daily life, yet these successors saw themselves as heirs to Sumerian culture. They preserved Sumerian titles and rituals. The kings of Isin still called themselves kings of Sumer and Akkad. The scribal elite continued to teach and use Sumerian. Centuries of school tablets from Babylonian cities show scribes diligently learning Sumerian grammar and copying Sumerian myths and hymns. Even in the first millennium BCE, Assyrian scholars in Nineveh were still referencing Sumerian texts for wisdom. In essence, Sumer became the classical foundation of Mesopotamian culture. The continuity of Sumerian learning is exemplified by a charming old Babylonian story called School Days, written in Sumerian, which recounts a pupil's woes in the tablet house. The student endures a day of chastisements for poor writing and showing up late. only to have his father invite the teacher home for dinner and gifts. Placated by their hospitality, the teacher returns the next day with gentler treatment. Such a narrative shows a more human side of Sumer's legacy, the educational values and humor of those ancient people, transmitted long after their power had faded. The Sumerians' influence extended to their Semitic successors' religion, lore, and literature. Major Sumerian works, hymns, lamentations, epics, were copied and studied by later Babylonians and Assyrians, becoming the core of the Mesopotamian scholastic tradition. For example, the Babylonian epic of Gilgamesh was built upon earlier Sumerian stories, and Sumerian deities like Inanna, Enlil, and Enki continued to be worshipped, although under Semitic names like Ishtar, Elil, and Ea. The very institution of kingship in Mesopotamia carried a Sumerian imprint. Titles such as Lugal and the ideal of the just, temple-building king, were inherited from Sumer. Well, today, we often call Sumerians the cradle of civilization, and rightly so. It's a story that allows us to look back over 5 millennia and witness the dawn of civilization. In a real sense, the Sumerians wrote the opening chapter of human civilization, inscribing their legacy in clay for all future ages to discover. For us in the modern time, the study of Sumer offers not only a chronicle of kings and battles, but it is a window into the very genesis of urban society and human creativity. Thanks to the tireless decipherment of cuneiform, we can now directly read Sumerian words from thousands of years ago, all the way from King Shulgi's boasting hymn to a humble pupil's school essay, forging an intimate connection with people who laid humanity's first civilizational foundation. And that's pretty special, don't you think? Well, if you don't think so, I don't know how you made it 1 hour and 22 minutes into the video. Me sitting here with my cold. I'm just getting over a cold, I do apologize, so that's why my voice is perhaps a little bit off today. But I'm doing my best. Have to keep putting coal into the furnace, don't you? And where else were you going to go and learn about Sumer? I don't know, there's probably other channels. I'm just rambling now. I want to thank the top-tier patrons and supporters: Dark, Kimberly, Christine, Sally, Ember, Susan, Cameron, Legitmus, Carrie, Charlene, Lynn, Therese, Katiana, Nicholas, Ulfinir, Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neuronerd, Erin, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa, Orthodox Review, Scott, Stark Factory, Shell, Wendy, Josie, Sarah, Ryan, Thor, Cameron, Stefan, Kevin, HMSHH, Crystal, Dalvery, Anthony, Lucy, Brandon, and Gugu Bubonic. Okay, well, that is enough from me tonight. Unless you want to go watch another video, which, well, you're welcome to do so. But as for me, that's enough. I hope you're all doing all right out there. I'm doing okay. As always, I wish you all the best. Lots of love to all of you, wherever you are in the world. And good night.